All right, so today we have with us Dr. Ofelia Garcia and Dr. Ricardo Otheguy. So Dr. Ofelia Garcia is Professor Emerita in the PhD programs in Urban Education in Latin American, Iberian, and Latino cultures at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Garcia has published widely in the areas of bilingualism, multilingualism, and bilingual education, language education, language policy, and sociology of language. The American Educational Research Association has awarded her 3 Lifetime Research Achievement Awards, Distinguished Contributions to Social Context in Education, Bilingual Education, and Second Language Acquisition Leadership through Research. She is a member of the U.S. National Academy of Education, and for more, visit www.opheliagarcia.org. Ricardo Otheguy is Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at the Graduate Center of the University of New York. His work has appeared in major international journals. His interest in theoretical linguistics are in functional semiotic approaches to grammar, variationist sociolinguistics, and communicative and conceptual approaches to language continuity and change in situations of contact. In applied linguistics, his publications are in the areas of bilingualism and the education of Latinos in the United States. We're so thrilled to have you here today, and Dr. Ofelia Garcia and Dr. Ricardo Otheguy, the floor is yours.
Oh, well, I can get started. You will hear that I always get started and then Ricardo always contradicts what I'm saying, but I don't think he will contradict my saying that we are awed at the group of scholars that are here today and the kinds of things that we're going to do today, because as you well know, because you have been here for a long time in this forum, Sinfrey Marconi encouraged us to think out of the box and to do things out of the box. So what he asked us to do today is to talk about our own trajectory in our lives and in our scholarship that have led us to the positions that we hold today. So thank you for accompanying us in this trajectory that we don't know where it's going. But you know, it's always wonderful to take a risk because I'm so tired of what children in school, since I work in schools a lot, do this thing of show and tell, which they show and they tell something, but it doesn't show the rough edges of the work. I think in a personal conversation, we will show the rough edges of our work. Ricardo, you want to say something? You're muted. You're muted.
I wanted to echo Ophelia's warm words of thank you to all of you for being here. This is a very impressive group, and I am very, very grateful for your having me here. My name is Ricardo Otheguy. I tell people that my name is pronounced Otheguy and that it rhymes with Peggy, and then people call me Professor Peggy. But no, it's Professor Otheguy. And thank you all for having us here. This is a wonderful opportunity indeed, and I'm looking forward to interacting with all of you all over the world. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's very kind of you to ask me and ask us to come.
So I think I'll start with sort of the bookends because it's interesting that Ricardo and I started in the same island and ended up in the same island. So I'll just tell you that both of us were born in Cuba. I came to New York City, straight to New York City at the age of 11. Ricardo will tell you about his trajectory in a second. We ended up in the same island in Manhattan, New York City. Many, many years later, we have three children and 7 grandchildren. And our children always ask us if we met in Cuba because we seem to know the same songs and share a lot of history, and yet we have been very different. And we not only ended in the same, we not only started in the same island and ended in the same island, but I started, at least academically, in the same institution as Ricardo. And I'll tell you how he didn't want to hire me. But I started in the same institution, and we actually ended in the same institution. So it's interesting that these things have come together. Ricardo?
Well, I mean, Ofelia has said it all. I am myself a Cuban. I'm more of a Cuban than Ofelia. I claim greater Cubanness because I came to the United States at age of 14 with a stop in New Orleans. So I did high school and college in New Orleans. I'm a graduate of Louisiana State University. Then I came to New York. And I was very lucky to be born on that island. My very first work in linguistics was about Afro-Cuban speech. So I was blessed to have this opportunity and this insight to have lived a little bit more than Ofelia in Havana. And then I ended up in New York, like a lot of other people seeking fame and fortune. And I was very lucky to hire Ofelia. I signed the papers for the hiring. She's lying to you that I didn't want her. So, and it's great that that personal life has taken us to the intellectual life that we've had.
So I'll tell you a little bit about the trajectory with bilingualism, because I think that's important. I think you've heard it already, that I want to talk about myself first. I grew up in, of course, a home in which bilingual practices were part of our daily life. Why? I was the oldest of 4 children. My mother, I had a young brother who was a year old when he arrived. My mother became pregnant and had another child. So actually the family had children born in New York City, and those of us who were not. We lived in a Latino community. So we heard Spanish and English all the time. So bilingualism was very much part of my family experience from the very beginning. And I'll go on, and then Ricardo can pick up. I always say that I remember the first words I understood in English. And the first words that I understood in English were said by a very good bilingual friend who was speaking to my teacher. And I understand, and I've always remembered when she said, don't worry about her, she's just a stupid Cuban girl. And I think from that moment on, I realized that language and who we are have nothing to do with each other. And that I wanted to make sure that people understood that just because children did not speak English, it didn't make them stupid. So that was, I think, my first, grounded experience in bilingualism. I'll go on to high school. At that time, because we're both old, as you heard, we're both emeritus. At that time, they used to stream students, right? So they gave a test, and they put you in the level of the class according to your English language proficiency, of course. And of course, I hadn't been here in the country for very long. I didn't do well in the test, and they put me in the slow group. And I think, as I think back, again, this was for me a realization that was important about language, because I took a course called English, in which we discussed English literature and all of that. But it was always, who were the characters? What were they doing? And then a lot of sort of remedial work around language, right? So it was all remedial. And I had the good fortune of having a teacher when I was a junior in high school, when I was in the third grade of high school, that thought that I could do better. And she actually fought that I be transferred to a more advanced English class. And I remember sitting in that class the first week and thinking, what are these kids doing? Because what they were discussing and what they were doing in an English class, which was named exactly the same as my other English class, was completely different, right? They were discussing things like, why do you think that these characters were doing this? How would you have done this? They were critical of the text. And it was for me a big realization how content could be called the same, right? The same asignatura, the same subject, and yet what you're giving those who can and those who can't was completely different. And that for me has been something that has stayed with me forever. And I'll finish with college, and then I can go on, but I'll give Ricardo a chance. Then I went on to college, and I'm a proud graduate of City University. My parents couldn't afford anything else at that time. And I went to Hunter College, which is part of City University, and I took my first Spanish course. I remember that my professor, it was one of these things that stays with you. And her name was Professor Bonilla. And Professor Bonilla would always tell me and the other two Latin Americans who were in the class at that time, a Dominican and a Puerto Rican, always used to tell us, así no se dice, that's not the way you say it. And I always used to say, how could you tell me that's not the way you say it when actually this is the way my mother says it all the time? I remember one time when we were discussing words that end in ION that need an accent in Spanish. And I gave the example of bocón, which means you have a big mouth, bocón. And she said to me, that word doesn't exist. And I said, how could you tell me that? My mother calls my brothers bocón all the time, right? So this for me was also a realization that I didn't fit linguistically in any of the parameters that they were giving me about English or Spanish or even bilingualism. I'll give Ricardo a chance before I get to professionally.
Okay, I didn't know we were doing biography, but I'll do a little bit of that. My life has been marked from the time I was young by encounters and misencounters and confusions and miscommunications having to do with language and identity. I am the second of a string of 4 generations of bilingual people. My father spoke English and French, and in addition to his natural Spanish. And when we left Cuba, he wanted to go to New Orleans instead of going to Miami, because he figured in New Orleans, a well-known French-speaking city, he would do much better. Of course, he got to New Orleans and discovered that no one spoke French in New Orleans, which was in fact a sleepy southern town right in the heart of Dixie. And the first impression that I had of the United States was that my father took me to the public school to, register me. And he was told that no, that he could not register me in the school unless he obtained a certification, an affidavit showing that I was white. And it was then that my father and I discovered that in New Orleans at the time, there were white schools and black schools. And my father said, well, we were white in Cuba, we're gonna be white here. Little did he know what expected Latinos in the United States as far as racial affiliation and things of that nature. So we did register, and I ended up in the white school, which was of course all in English. And my father's idea that we would be in a French-speaking city came to naught. And then of course I immediately started to hang out with all the Latino children, and we used to spend a lot of time doing our favorite trick, which was to write in the back of the bus. When you write on the back of the bus, you see, we're old enough to remember segregation in New Orleans and in the United States. And so we created all sorts of trouble for people because we were a Latin American collection of motley looking people of all shades and colors. And some of us were very white looking, some of us were very dark looking, and the drivers didn't know what to do with us. And we had a great time disrupting that situation in New Orleans. So that's how I grew up when I came to the United States. Then I also went to the public college. And there I was still trying to get my English straight. I had a wonderful experience of 2 years in high school in that public school with very supportive and very good teachers, except some of them found it difficult to deal with the then starting influx of people from Latin America. And I finished college. It was all very well. I took a little linguistics in college, which was very, very useful. And then I came to New York, and I will leave you before we go to the professional part with an experience from high school that I have yet not forgotten and that I think is very telling. I had Mrs. Renault, a good New Orleans name, for trigonometry on third period. And the first day I came and got to class, and she asked for names. And I said, my name was Ricardo. And she stopped and she said, no, I'm sorry. I can't deal with this. This is getting out of hand. I have Roberto first period, Fernando second period, and now Ricardo. No, all of you will be Fernando. And you can imagine what would happen today if someone did that. But that's the world in which I grew up and the world in which this young Cuban teenager first encountered the United States.
Okay, so I'll take over. We really haven't rehearsed this. So this is like a dance that is like Cuban jazz, which is, you know, we take over as we see fit. I started teaching when I finished college, and my first experience was in what was then Hell's Kitchen, which was really Hell's Kitchen. It's now gentrified and it means something else. And I was given a group of children who were all Puerto Rican and did not speak English. And I was supposed to teach them in English. And I did the first week. I was a young teacher, but fortunately, at a time, we're just coming out of all the civil rights era, and there were very progressive educators in the school. And about a week later, I went in and I told the head teacher, this doesn't make sense. And he said, what doesn't make sense? And I said to him, well, I'm teaching them in a language they don't understand, but I have a language in common with them. So I don't want to do this way. And he said, well, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'm going to do it bilingually, the same way that I do my house, my family. So I'm just going to do it bilingually. And he said to me, what does that mean? And I said, I have no idea, but I'm going to try. And so I did that. At the same time, I went for a doctorate. And at the time, of course, there was no such thing as a doctorate in bilingual education or any of that. And I had the good fortune of joining the Graduate Center, the City University of New York, where I ended my career, and a doctorate in Latin American studies. And I used to do semiotics. And I was always interested in bilingual authors, bilingual poets, bilingual authors, because again, the only way that I had to find myself in this place where there was no relationship between Cuba and the United States, absolutely no way of going back, was in my books. So I read. And I finished my doctorate, and there was a position at the City College in bilingual education. And I remember that my mentor, I had a very good mentor as I taught, and I made sense of the classroom, came and said, you should apply. And I said, I theoretically, I don't know anything about bilingual education. And she said to me, well, no one does, but you know how to do it. So apply. So I applied, and that is where Ricardo's story comes in, and then I'll continue.
So I also did my doctorate at the City University of New York, having left New Orleans and all the trials and tribulations there. And I think many of you, I was very much influenced by my dissertation advisor at the Graduate Center. I had the great fortune of doing a dissertation in a grammatical topic with Erica Garcia. Erica Garcia was an Argentinian who was at the time establishing what became known as the Columbia School of Linguistics. And she and Diver and the many graduate students who both at Columbia and at the Graduate Center of CUNY were beginning to follow them, were very much exposed to what was at that time especially a dissenting view, because it was not a Chomskyan view of grammar. And it was an anti-Chomskyan view, especially because of a rejection on the part of Garcia and Diver of the categories of traditional grammar. Now, why was this important? This was important to me, I think, not only because of the actual way in which the Columbia School of Linguistics people do grammatical analysis, but because for the first time, I was exposed to a critical approach. I was exposed to the idea that what's out there, what everybody is doing, you don't have to do it, that you need to decide for yourself what makes sense. So this was for me a tremendous breakthrough, because they allowed me to and forced me to think for myself, not only about grammar, but perhaps more importantly, about many, many other topics. And so I had studied some dialectology in college, and this allowed me to think and wonder about the notion of grouping people into dialects, which I was beginning to be somewhat suspicious of, and became more suspicious as the time went along. Gradually, I began to learn to think about the difference between a linguistic definition of a group and a prior a priori social definition of a group. And this has been, continues to be in some ways at the heart of my interest, the tension between the individual and the group, and how one creates groups in linguistics and whether they are legitimate or not. And at the end of my career, when I was already very advanced, I ran into Simfrey's ideas about language and what is and what is not a language, and how language is in many ways a social invention. I was ready for it. I was ready to understand that kind of thinking, which has been very important to me for now quite a bit of time. So maybe
Good.
Now you should talk
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah. So I told you that I started teaching bilingually without having any theoretical grounding on it. So I was fortunate that I went to study with Joshua Fishman. I had a postdoc at Yeshiva University. And, you know, I was very fortunate, really. Fishman was everything I was not. He was an Orthodox Jew. I was a Latina from New York. I knew very little about anything. But the more that I studied with him, and by the way, I always say, I know everything I know because of Joshua Fishman. So it's not that I'm ungrateful. It's just that the more that I heard and I studied the concepts that he treasured, diglossia, language maintenance per se, stable bilingualism, the more that I thought it doesn't fit my life, right? And I must say, he was always a very generous mentor. He always used to say, well, every generation and every people have to make sense of the work differently. So maybe what I think doesn't fit you. And I was really fortunate. And I think some of what Ricardo and I have been saying is the tension that we have experienced in our lives and in our work, the cracks that continuously, you know, the things, the containers that they make us think with that do not fit my reality anyway. So I was fortunate at the same time that New York City was a very Puerto Rican city at that point. And I worked very closely with the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. And there was a language policy task force that did work on the East Harlem community, the community traditionally known as El Barrio. And people like Pedro Pedraza continuously questioned the concept of diglossia, for example, saying, this doesn't work in the East Harlem community. This is not what people do. So it was always sort of didn't fit the reality, right? And I think, like Ricardo says, I think the most important lesson that I can sort of transmit to young people is describe with your own lenses, and don't let the lenses of the older scholars cloud yours. Look for yourself, describe closely, describe with really fidelity to what you're seeing and what you're hearing. And I do think that for me, like for Ricardo, it was actually the reading of Disinventing Language that did it for me, that gave me the courage to say, okay, nothing that I've done in my long career makes sense. And I have to think about language and bilingualism differently and name it differently. Ricardo?
Yeah, I was thinking that one of my earliest experiences with this tension that Ofelia is talking about was studying Latin American dialectology, where at the time there was a great preoccupation with the question of which was the Spanish dialect in the peninsula that was the base of Latin American Spanish. This was a lot of trees were felled with papers on this topic, and I studied this for my master's. I read a lot of this for my PhD, and I was particularly impressed by the fact that the usual answer at the end of much discussion was that what was happening in Latin America was in fact a mixture of dialects, and that there was no way that one could pin down exactly which was the origin of Latin American Spanish, and that what one ended up having to do, which did make sense to me, was to trace the origin of certain features of Latin American Spanish to certain areas, perhaps, and certain speakers in the peninsula. So this early question of which was the dialect of origin, and the fact that the answer really ended up in some ways giving up, and that it made much more sense to me to ask questions like, well, how about the origin of the sibilants in Latin American Spanish, and the fact that they are in many ways different from many of the peninsular speakers. What is the origin of that feature? And this idea that one can then is given authority to think about features of language in a disaggregated way became gradually something that I have come to think more and more about, and that I was able to do it because of this early experience during my PhD of being allowed to think critically about the prevailing paradigms. So again, I think that when Ofelia says that's a good message for the young people, I think that is really a very important one. And this idea of disaggregating linguistic features and not necessarily beginning with the notion of a language or a dialect gradually grew as a more important view of my perception of language and of language contact. And I just finished a paper called the Speaker, Not the Language, in language contact in Latin America. And so that idea has colored my perception of language, of contact, and of language in Latin America and in the bilingual situations in the United States.
So we get to translanguaging this way, both of us from different perspectives. My work has always been in schools, in community, but in schools. That's where the tension really becomes very evident, because you have these practices at home in bilingual homes and bilingual communities that are then completely erased when you walk into the school. And so for me, that was a place of real importance because it can make a difference. And the tension is felt all the time. And so I get to translanguaging, and someone, Sangita is probably in the room somewhere, and she has questioned why the trans, give up the trans. But you pick up terms as you go along. And I have to say that it was Colin Baker who, when I still was with the concept of, no, you have to separate the languages, when I still had my diglossic mentality, that said to me, why? And said to me, come look at what we're doing in Wales. And so when we started, when I saw what was being done in Wales, I thought, okay, this is a good name for something that is different, that is not additive bilingualism, because additive bilingualism did not work in my family. There was something else. It was dynamic. And I thought, and perhaps, going back and reflecting on it, it might not even be a good term, because some people misunderstand the trends as just thinking of it going across. And I think pedagogically, especially when we think about translanguaging as a pedagogical approach or pedagogical practices, I think that's the way that many people understand it. And I'm troubled by it, because the trans for me was always thinking of furthering Sinfree Makoni's and Alistair Pennycook's position. The trans for me was always about transcending language. Transcending language as is curricularized in schools, right? And again, because Ricardo had really taught me to, and he wasn't the only one, but certainly his view about making sure that the speaker was at the center also worked for me. So transcending this idea of language and thinking of the speaker and who you, and the learner, and who were you teaching. So that's how we started with translanguaging. And I think that translanguaging for us has had also a trajectory. But for me, I think the aspect of justice and the aspect of cracking, opening up a space, that's why I talk about translanguaging space, opening up a space in education so that people can be people and not who they ask us to be. To me, that political stance, that concept of cognitive justice was always very important. And I must say that as I look at how scholars pick it up, many of them do not have not really focused on the, I know that it's controversial, but what I think is still the transformational aspects of translanguaging. And I think they're transformational because schools for the populations that I work with, racialized, minoritized, bilingual populations, schools have always developed a subjectivity of inferiority. This is what we create. We create the failure. By educating them in the ways that we do, we create the failure. So this, to me, is a way of maybe transforming the subjectivities of inferiority that schools create. Ricardo.
So in this tension between the individual and the community, and the realization for me that there is some kind of reality to social groups, I made a stop at variationist sociolinguistics, and I taught myself to do Labovian type of linguistics, and I still do it and did it and to still do it with a number of students who've become my colleagues. And I'm still struggling with that, but variationist sociolinguistics does give one the possibility of beginning feature by feature, speaker by speaker, and then seeing what can come from that, and then being able to take the speaker's conception of what the social groupings are and trying to work them into the analysis. So that was an important stage in my life too. And gradually, as I became more and more preoccupied with questions of applied linguistics and questions of how we were treating young people, I began to worry more and more about the problem of this a priori definition of language. And I bumped into the problem of incomplete acquisition and the idea that I was being told by some of my colleagues that the generation of American-born Russians and American-born Latinos and American-born Haitians and American-born Chinese, that none of these young people spoke the language completely. And I began to then realize that there was great intellectual danger in this notion of a language such that it could be complete or incomplete. And I began to write against this notion of incomplete acquisition and to try to show the grave injustice being done to these speakers by labeling them as people who did not speak the language completely or did not speak the language in its totality, and how in fact this represented a terrible throwback to a prescriptivist view of language that I thought had disappeared from linguistics. So this has been also a great concern of mine, this notion that we have in some ways lost touch with the tradition of Boas and Sapir and the way that they approached languages by kind of looking at them without necessarily measuring them against some outside standard. A very old idea in linguistics, which however the notion of incomplete acquisition completely sets aside and gets us back to a very prescriptive stance when it comes to the language of the generation of, in part our generation, but especially the generation of our children. And so I have been railing against this for a very long time. And the notion of translanguaging is quite helpful because that too, the idea that the bilingual speaker is bilingual only for sure in a social way, because society regards that person as having two languages, may in fact not be true psycholinguistically, and that person may in fact internally have only one system, I think is extremely important, because a lot of the criticism that is leveled against bilingual people in the United States is that somehow they're psychologically inferior because they do not control this language cognitively to the extent that they should. So that very strict division between individual and social conceptions of what the bilingual is, I think has also been helpful for me to try to make sense of what is going on. And I find it very disappointing, for example, that what used to be called in American universities Spanish for native speakers, which was the Spanish classes for people who spoke Spanish from home, gradually drifted into the notion of Spanish for heritage speakers. And now the heritage speaker, I think, has become an unfortunate term that simply, again, relabels these speakers as not measuring up. And when you really inquire what it is that they do not measure up against, it is in fact a conception of somehow some abstract notion of standard Spanish that's out there that they do not, again, they do not measure up to.
So maybe one more concept, and then I think we could open it up for discussion, and that is the other, I think, controversial aspect of our work, which has been the unitary conception of the repertoire rather than, and I think this again relates to the controversy over whether the trans is just going across or whether trans is in the way that we have always defined it as transcending language, right? So again, people find the unitary repertoire idea difficult. As you know, our good colleague, Jeff McSwan, has railed against it and insists in calling it a multilingual translanguaging, which to me in Spanish is disparate. It doesn't make sense because you're holding on to multilingualism in the traditional way of thinking of the languages, and at the same time you're picking up this term, and it doesn't make sense. I mean, it's it would make more sense to just continue with code switching and forget about all of this. But the unitary for me is important. The way that I work with teachers to make them think about the unitary repertoire is very simple. We have always thought, teachers always think that children have boxes of languages, right? In our case, 2 boxes, right? And my emphasis is on getting them to think that children have a string of pearls that are different features, but they're in a string that we use depending on where we need the features, how we need the features, right? And for me, it's important for 2 reasons. One is because you can never then leave the box behind. You always have to bring it with you because it's there. The pearls are always there, whether you're using only features that are about 1 pearl in schools, right? Because in schools, there is a difference between the process of education and maybe shepherding the students towards a product in 1 language. So there's always that tension, and that's a tension that I think teachers have to deal with. But in thinking about it this way, I think they start to understand that even when you're moving them towards a product in 1 language, because you're teaching, I don't know, German, which is not the case, but then you're bringing all of the pearls with you. And I think that's important for them conceptually to think about. And for me, the other huge reason for insisting that the repertoire is unitary is assessment. Because unless we think that the repertoire is unitary, we will continue to test students in 1 language and the other. And even if we do assess them in 1 language and the other, you are not capturing the whole child. The whole child, the whole bilingual child, the whole bilingual student has to be captured by taking account of their unitary repertoire. So for me, that's the insistence on the unitary, the idea that we have to create a space where these students are looked at and assessed holistically with their internal ways of doing language, with their ability to do language, and not with these external concepts, and not, like Ricardo says, always comparing them to white monolingual English-speaking students, because that, again, is what creates a failure. There will always be a gap. We will never be able to solve the gap if we assess them that way. Ricardo.
So at the social level, to me, it was an important part of my life when, thanks to an invitation from my good friend Leketi Makalela, I spent some time with Ofelia in South Africa, and I kept hearing about I forget now whether it was 17 different... 11 languages of South Africa. And I kept saying, well, fine, it's your country, you guys know, but it strikes me that these 11 languages are very likely not 11 languages, but 11 social categories that you have raised into language status. And then going back to the individual, how many languages do individuals really have? Do they cognitively possess all these languages? And that sort of kept me thinking. But of course, to me, the main in addition to my critique of the notion of incomplete acquisition and my belief that the grammar of the languages of second generation bilinguals in the United States are as complete as they come. The other notion that becomes interesting is, to me, the notion of code switching. Because of course, if the competence of people who are called bilinguals or trilinguals or whatever is unitary, and even though the society defines them as speaking two very separate boxes of two different languages, if their mental representation is unitary, then of course, the term code switching is another one of those categories that that my teacher, Erica Garcia, taught me to question, because code switching, of course, makes sense from a social point of view. As you hear it, you may want to think that you're hearing the speaker switching from one language to the other. But I think we have every reason to doubt that so-called code switching is cognitively code switching. And so that's the other big part, I think, of the translanguaging idea that needs to be taken into account. In the communities where I live and in the families where I live, the notion that there is that there are two totally cognitively separate languages, that one is going from one to the other, seems to me difficult to sustain. And that what we have is some features of the speaker, of that unitary repertoire, some features being labeled one thing and some features being labeled another. And I think if you stop and look at the arguments for code switching being cognitively real, you begin to realize that they leak a lot more than they appear to. So that's the other part that I think is interesting, that maintaining this notion of languages as social inventions, of dialects as being social constructs, and trying to think about the speaker, then some of these well-established categories like code switching become something that welcome examination, and that I think that's something that we should all do when we have a chance.
And maybe to end, so that you can talk, it's interesting to me as I hear this, because I had never thought of this, how we also have moved in our own lives. I mean, we started the work about bilingualism when we were really feeling like immigrants. But we since have 3 children that we raised bilingually, and now we have 7 grandchildren that are being raised bilingually along all points of the continuum with 3 different home constitutions, right? It's been interesting for us, for me anyway. I don't know if Ricardo has thought about this, how also the work has moved along with our lives, so that it's now we're into the 3rd generation of bilinguals in the family, and how this also has influenced even more the way that we think about bilingualism and translanguaging as something that is an important feature of American society, certainly, and of our own lives. Ricardo, okay?
I wanted to say about our family that people laugh at me when I tell them that my family reminds me of the preface of the Handbook of American Indian Languages by Boas. They say, how can you possibly connect your grandchildren with Boas? And the reason that I do is because in the 3 families of our children, the degree of bilingualism does not match the degree of ethnicity. We have the child who married the Cuban in our family has the children who are the least bilingual, and the children who married the gringos have the children who are the most bilingual, so that this is like it's being discovered all the time in this terrible, terrible, unfortunate situation in Ukraine, where people keep being shocked that many Russian speakers are in fact loyal Ukrainian citizens. And this junction between language and ethnicity and a sense of belonging to a group does not necessarily have to be 100% and a one-to-one correspondence. That's something that we see in our own family, and I think that's that Boas's point that language and ethnicity do not have to go together is something that keeps coming up. So maybe we should let people ask questions, Ofelia.
Gracias. Bassi, I guess, is taking over.
Thank you so very much, Ofelia and Ricardo. Sinfree, would you like to take the first tap, as it were?
Let me ask the first question. Okay, no, let me first of all thank both of you for the impact of your work on some of the things that I've been doing in my career. The most clear exposition of what Alistair Pennycook and myself were trying to do was written by Ofelia in the foreword to our book, Disinvention. When she wrote that foreword, I remember Alistair and myself saying, oh, you know what, she gets it. I mean, she has articulated the argument much better than we were trying to do. Because she got the argument, and Alistair was saying that Ofelia reads very well, that she got the core of the argument. At that point, Ofelia managed to articulate that argument about disinvention and social inventions of language much clearer than we had between the two of us. So I can only say thank you very much for that. Now, I want to get back to a couple of issues. You're both established scholars, etc. Where do you differ? What are the subtle differences between your styles of scholarship, which are not obvious to outsiders?
You want to start, Ricardo? And then I'll disagree.
Yes, okay. Yes, Ricardo.
I think the most important difference between us is that I, despite all the years, continue to be perhaps a child of the 1970s and of that good part of the Chomskyan movement, which was mentalism. I still think, for better or worse, in terms of mental grammars that individuals have in their brains, not lined up according to the social categories, but I think in terms of mental grammars. And this creates terrible tensions in this household, and I'm always at risk of being kicked off the table or other places because of my belief in grammar and the existence of a cognitive thing called a grammar.
Yes, I want to agree with that one, you see. Yeah, and because for me, because I think my work has been always in classrooms, basically, I think of practices first. I don't ascribe too much power to the mental anything. And when we write together, I often have to argue about making sure that the mental isn't there, and sometimes it gets in, but that's not where the emphasis of my work is, and we do disagree on that. And I think that's a disagreement that is healthy, because I think that, again, just like in the work in life, there are these tensions. You know, our good friend and scholar Jose del Valle always calls it incomodidad, being uncomfortable. So it's being uncomfortable that causes generation of ideas. And I think this one is one that has pushed us, but we have not been able to solve. And as a matter of fact, the 2015 article, in which Ricardo is the first author in, it took us like 3 years of negotiation to finally write that one, because I couldn't let go. And we finally had a third author who used to come very often, and he sort of made it happen for us. But that was a very difficult one. And the answer to Jeff Maxwell, which came in 2019, was also something that I think Ricardo picked up. But I think that, again, it's very important to look at something from different perspectives.
Yes.
And I think, Simfrey, we know that it's not until the linguists start engaging with these questions that we're not going to make a difference, because the linguists are always going to be there. So I always welcome Ricardo in these conversations, because I think in talking about it, we cracked open some ideas, concepts that he had, and he informed me of things that I did not have. And I think it's in the dialogue where these things could happen. But that's one. The mentalism of the whole thing is one that we have not been able to solve.
And I think one idea, to give you some idea of how this works, Ofelia keeps saying things like, how can you possibly believe that there is an innate grammar? I said, no, I'm not saying that there is an innate grammar. There may be, in fact, some innateness in the semiotic tendency of humans, but I'm not saying that it's innate. She says all of this is formed in society. I said, fine, all of this is formed in society, but at some point, an inventory of meanings and the meanings of forms and the meanings of constructions forms a grammar in the individual. So we battle over my idea that there is a grammar, even though it is a socially assembled grammar by the child, and it goes on like that. So you ask for a disagreement, that's one.
That's one.
Big one. That's a big one. Yeah.
That's a big one. Yeah. And then what is interesting is when I read your work separately, and when you're writing individually, and when you're writing jointly, the difference comes in when you're writing jointly, as Alistair Pennycook puts it. He says that it's easy to see the influence of Ricardo in their joint article. The arguments are tightly constructed. There must be evidence that must be what? You must cite the linguistic evidence to support this. But if it's Ofelia working on her own, she allows herself ideologically to run free. So, so that there are different styles, he says. You can see the differences. Ofelia goes ahead of all the evidence. Ricardo frames the argument in such a way that he needs the evidence before he makes the statement. Am I correct in that way?
I think we'll both take it as a compliment.
But simply, it's interesting that you say that, because the older I am, the more that I know that if the question is, what is the evidence, and who has the evidence, and why is that the evidence, right? So there is so much in our academic scholarship that is constrained by traditions and by concepts that unless we break away from them, it's so someone has to sort of say, no, this is what we see. I just had the argument with an editor of a journal about research methodology, because, again, translanguaging, if you're going to capture it in a community, in a natural setting, it's impossible to have IRB, signed consent forms. So, I mean, that's in Lovu's argument with the on-file article, which I think is very good. We have to push against all of that. So It's my evidence in my 50-year career, in my observations, in my life. So it's my evidence, which isn't seen by many people. You know, it's so unless we start saying this is the way it is in our lives, I think we are not going to crack these strictures in the way that we're forced to think about ourselves and in the way that we're forced to act in the world. So, and in the academy especially.
Let me ask one question, then I can try and see if I can get Cecile before she goes to the airport. Right. You say you originally are from Cuba. What is the state of the art of applied linguistics or linguistics as sub-disciplines in Cuba? What do they work on in Cuba? And what has been your impact? What has been the impact of your work on scholarship in Cuba, for example?
Ricardo,
do they follow your work?
Yes, I think the answer has to be disappointing. As far as I know, the answer is none. Ofelia and I went through a period when we went to Cuba quite a bit in the 1990s, I think it was. We taught at the university. We had a lot to do with the students. I helped train Cuban interpreters in the school for interpreters. And we had an active life in Cuba for a while, mostly thanks to a contact that Ofelia had developed in the Minister for Tertiary Education, as they call it. But then, that person passed away. These contacts dried up, and it is not always easy for Cuban-born people who left Cuba before 1970 to get into Cuba. It's not impossible by any means, but there is lots of paperwork. We have missed planes because we haven't had the right paperwork received from the Cuban government. So I would have always liked to have had more contact, and still would, with the Cuban higher education establishment, but we did for a while. And as far as I know, right now there isn't. I mean, I know with me there isn't much contact at all.
Yeah, well, the same with me. I do think that we follow some of the linguists in Cuba. And the journals that they produce. I think the scholarship is still very traditional. Not certainly our work has not been in any way received.
Okay, Cecile, I understand you are going to be leaving at 10:30, so why don't you jump in? Does this Ricardo Ofelia discussion echo any remote experience in your life?
Well, I'm not sorry, Simpri, I'm not going to talk about that. But
you can ask, we can jump in and say whatever.
No, but I have a very pointed question to both Ofelia and Ricardo. When you come up with a notion, a concept, it happens that the concept or the notion has its life, by itself. It develops, and we all know that. So I wanted you to reflect on the ways in which the notion of translanguaging has been taken up and by different scholars from different parts of the world, and how it has been resisted. And one of the things, I'm an Africanist, and one of the things I heard a lot from other African scholars is that not in South Africa, because the notion has been very popular, but it was, we've been doing that our entire life. It's just that this is nothing new. Maybe it has a name, but it is nothing actually new. We've been living, we've been playing and living in in different languages. So these are my two questions. So how how do you reflect on the ways in which the notion has been taken up, and what do you tell scholars, African scholars who have, you know, the kind of reaction that they have? Thank you.
Thanks, Cecile. Well, I'll start, Ricardo, this time. I think it's absolutely true that all of us have been doing this our entire life, right? I mean, I think we started with our lives precisely because it was nothing new in our life either. It just took freedom to say that it was different, to say it. Scholarship didn't say it. I mean, and still I walk into classrooms every day where the scholarship is about, don't open up this space, this is terrible. So I think that you should tell them, yes, absolutely. And that is the reason why we need to shake things up, because they haven't told us, they haven't legitimated practices that have existed from the very beginning. Certainly, especially practices that are the life of countries in Africa and in Asia, for example, because of the influence of the global North, right? So, you know, in which we're privileged to live. So, you know, for us, it's easier, I think, because we stand out. You know, we're in a global North where we are different, and therefore we can say it doesn't work for us. And I think sometimes when you're in a context where everybody's the same, but the global North is not seeing you, it's harder to say, hey, no, this is different. So that, as far as that is concerned, the way that it's taken up for me is sometimes worrisome, that especially translanguaging as pedagogical practices are being taken up a lot as just going across languages without the import of both the unitary repertoire and the political act that it represents. In some ways, even the going across is a political act, because it's a resistance to what usually happens in classrooms. And I always hope, I try never to stop people from thinking differently or acting differently, because that in itself is an act that is different from the norm. And I hope that by doing it that way, they start seeing something different. But you have to have the space in which it happens before you see. And I think that there are, especially when we're thinking of major conceptual and educational changes, for me, you have to take steps. I always think of Martin Luther King's statement of, you don't have to see the whole staircase, just take the first step. And for some people, that is the first step. The first step is just recognizing multilingualism in its entirety. That wasn't even a step before. So I think that's a step into getting into the whole staircase that we're too old to be able to see, but maybe some of you will. Ricardo.
Thank you, Cecile. That's a wonderful question. Isn't it interesting that something can at the same time be old hat, everybody knew this already, and highly resisted? So there is an important question there. I think there is, in addition to the fact that these translanguaging practices have always existed, there is this issue of something that has always concerned me and many others here, which is the defense of the language, the awareness that minoritized languages are under attack, and so that my sympathies and interests in the Basques in Spain, and of course in us and the Latinos in the United States and our language, all of those are very real things, and they're very real interest. And therefore, I recognize the tension in the question when somebody says, well, if Spanish and English do not exist, do not exist, that's the way people usually pose the question, then how can you be interested in the survival and defense and the intergenerational transmission of Spanish? And what I tried to say is that we need to insist on the distinction between socially created categories and existence. To say that something is a socially created category does not mean to say that it does not exist. In fact, some of our most cherished notions are socially created, and that what I've been trying to say on this literature on translanguaging that Ofelia and I have created with our friend Wally, at least, and that Ofelia has created with Li Wei and with many other people, what I've been trying to say, what we've been trying to say, is that the distinction between the social and the cognitive has to be made very sharp, and that this has nothing to do with ontology in the sense of something not existing, but that it has to do with ontology in the sense of there being different kinds of ontologies, that the social construct of the language is very dear to me, and that I simply recognize it as a dear social institution, which is very different than from the cognitive possession of the individual, and especially the cognitive possession of the bilingual and the second generation immigrant in the case that we live in the United States. And that to recognize the competence and the strength of the grammar of these people is a totally different issue from the extent to which they may or may not adhere to socially created norms, and that these two things are both valid and they're both very real. And when it comes to code switching, if people want to say, well, I hear two different languages in that person's speech flow, I say, well, that's fine. You're welcome to hear that. But you have not provided us with the evidence that that hearing is in fact corresponded by two different sharply separate entities in the mind. So I am concerned, if you say the way it's been taken up, I am concerned when translanguages is simply taken to be another name for code switching or another name for pedagogical practices that may have been open before. But I am encouraged by the fact that I think translanguaging pedagogical practices have created a certain amount of empowerment and a certain amount of freedom that in the very narrow world in which we live in the United States have made positive contributions, even though in places where the linguistic situation is even more complex, these things may not be news. A lot of it in the United States is news at the applied linguistics level. And I think in the cognitive front, I think it is also important to keep making these ontological distinctions.
But I think Caroline wants to ask, Caroline McKinley.
Yeah, sure, Caroline, let's go ahead.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Bessie and Sinfri, and thank you very much to Ofelia and Ricardo. The kind of autobiography is really helpful in understanding more of where the concepts that you're working with comes from. The question that I have is whether we have to have a single or a kind of universal explanation for bilingualism, that it's one thing. So what I've been wondering is whether the way is it possible that it's different for children who are only introduced to another language later on, so later multilingualism or later bilingualism through formal schooling and so on, versus those who are growing up multilingually and in that home environment? Because it seems, that the idea of the unitary repertoire where the resources are all available and are fluidly drawn upon is not necessarily the same for people who have learned languages through formal education, kind of later on in life. And I think of my own experience, like that, where there's a difference with my English and then the language I learned at school with Afrikaans and isiXhosa and so on. So I'm just curious about your views on that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's an interesting question. One I struggle with all the time. But it's interesting that most bilinguals in the world are simultaneous bilinguals, right? So they're growing up in multilingual homes. And yet the scholarship has always been about sequential bilinguals, those that learn a second language later. And that in itself shows you the imbalance in power that our scholarships and our scholars are exerting, because there should be a lot more emphasis, given the number of children who are growing up in bilingual homes. There should be a lot more emphasis on that type of simultaneous bilingual acquisition than on those that learn it later on. I do think that simultaneous bilinguals, as you say, have all those resources at their disposal from the very beginning, and therefore it's a shame that schools don't acknowledge them. And of course, the other ones, the others that learn it later in school have only a limited repertoire that they then expand. However, I do think, first of all, practices that we will call translanguaging pedagogical practices have always existed in those spaces also, in language education traditional classrooms. I remember Angel Lin, the first time she heard me, she came to me and said, Ofelia, in Hong Kong, that's the way we've been doing it for generations, for 100 years. But don't pick up a book because they don't tell you to do it that way. We have to close the door. So in a way, it's opening the door also for a space in which this occurs, and this occurs in a way that is positive, that it doesn't make the teacher feel guilty. I mean, I walk into schools all the time where the teachers always say, well, this is the way we've been doing it, but we don't tell the supervisor. When the supervisor comes, we don't do it this way. We have to close the door. So all of that, I think, I think is important. And having said that, I think that once you think that what you're adding is not a box, right? It's not a separate autonomous box. When you're adding a traditional language classroom to children or to students that have never been exposed to that language before, once you stop thinking that you are going to add a box, and you start thinking that what you're doing is you're adding features that are different to the person's repertoire, I think it not only frees you up to use more of these translanguaging pedagogical practices, but also it makes a difference to the student, I think, because they realize that what they have is also useful, right? We always used to tell our students, I hope not anymore, but it happens, it's still happening. You have to, if you're going to write in English, you have to forget Spanish, for example, right? And of course, that's not it. I mean, because the way that we conceptualize with all our beings. There's never a text that's monolingual. When bilinguals or multilinguals read a text, we bring all of ourselves into that text, and therefore the text becomes dynamic. The text is multilingual and such. So I think it helps both cases, but you're right. I think it works differently, of course. Ricardo?
I think my answer is simple, perhaps even simplistic, and again, it betrays an old linguist trained in the 1970s. I think that yes, bilingualism is very different, and to me, the reason it is very different is because I theoretically place the difference in something that we may call language use and language performance. Which is quite separate from the speaker's grammar, so that different bilinguals, depending on whether they became bilingual from birth or later, may have different types of grammars, for sure. But in what we see in the United States, I think most of the differences come in performance. They come in the way people can implement their bilingualism. People who want to talk about incomplete acquisition in second generation speakers in the United States and the children of immigrants, that's what they call second generation, often talk about hesitation and disfluencies in the way that these speakers of Russian or Spanish, those are the two primary languages that the literature deals with, have, and this is evidence of an imperfect type of acquisition of a language. And I read these things and I say, I don't understand. I think that these are matters of training and usage. if language is, as I think, is basically an inventory of semiotic words and constructions and affixes with meaning, then the use of that system, of that repertoire of meaningful units will be different depending on how much you use it, depending on what language or what topic you're discussing, depending on how you are received. If you are in an American university where you are a second generation bilingual who is daily being told that you do that, tú no hablas español, even though that was a language you learned from birth, then of course the output is going to sound very different and seem very different from the output of who is this ideal person that one is measuring up the second generation and the bilinguals, at least in the United States, again, being very provincial. Well, it's the monolingual speaker, and there is this fetish of the monolingual speaker against which the bilingual is being compared. So I would say, yes, I think it is very true that bilingualism is very different in different people, but I would say that it is very different at the very important level of usage and performance. People do their languages differently depending on how they have acquired them, when, where, under propitious circumstances or circumstances of constant criticism. So I'd say, yes, I think you're quite right, that one needs to recognize many different kinds of bilingualism, but that I think they are all compatible with the cognitive notion of a unitary competence, that then when it becomes implemented, becomes in fact very different depending on many, many individual and contextual circumstances.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's very, very helpful.
Thank you. Sangeeta, would you like to pose your question directly?
Thank you, Ofelia and Ricardo. This is so enriching to get to know you through your biographies. And of course, to have this kind of a session where we are not just reading texts. I wanted to comment, and possibly my comment is related to Cecile's earlier question. And this is related to the circulation of concepts in the social sciences. Gurminder Brahmar, who visited the Global Forum last year probably, she has made quite a dent in how we reconceptualize the social sciences. So for instance, our ideas of where concepts come from and what they do in our own writings today cannot be just freed from the ways in which, for instance, the Renaissance has been conceptualized, what the French Revolution has given us in terms of nation states, etc. So when Ofelia, you referred to the article I wrote and where I discussed translanguaging and how this circulation of that concept emerged in Sweden after you visited my research group. I think that was in 2014 or 2015. What then happened was so striking. It's very unusual for a scholar to see a shift. It was almost alarming. I mean, I remember that at our conference, you presented translanguaging and no one had ever heard of it in Sweden. And the year after, no one was talking about anything except translanguaging. So a couple of my ex-PhD students brought this to my notice in terms of what they were seeing in the national Swedish school board. So the school board suddenly was doling out millions of kronas for research on translanguaging. And this kind of brought to my awareness this issue of circulation. And one of my ex-students and I, we did this study as a fun project in order to understand how that concept had emerged in Wales, and that particular classroom situation in one particular PhD student, how then that went on to New York, and how your participation in the CCD conference then kind of gave rise to this in the national Swedish landscape. So one of our findings was that the concept was being challenged by teachers in Swedish schools, and they were having a discussion in the National Teachers Magazine with researchers in Sweden. And the conflict, and this is ironical, the conflict was, what is the correct term in Swedish for translanguaging? So we found this, and that this was this particular 2018 study that we published in the International Journal of Multilingualism was trying to question something that you very eloquently pointed out, that people have been doing this, whatever this is, all the time. But when you come into classroom spaces in different national contexts, this is something we don't know how to deal with. So the point that I think I have raised earlier, and I continue to question, is that do we need another concept to call something that we have been doing all the time? Now, there is another way of looking at this. In Indian spaces where I have done field work for my own PhD in the end of the 80s and early 90s, and I was a PhD student in Sweden, but I was doing field work in Pune, Mumbai, and Delhi. And anyone who's been to these spaces knows that they're not bilingual, they're highly languaged spaces. I have never heard the term bilingual in those spaces in the late 80s and early 90s. When I come back to Indian spaces in 2012, to the same spaces in Mumbai to do field work, I suddenly hear college-educated teachers at NGOs talking about bilingualism. And that surprised me. 3 years as a PhD in those spaces, I'd never heard of that concept. In 2012, I suddenly start hearing about this. And lo and behold, today, there is this concept called translanguaging in Indian spaces. My point is that these kind of circulations need to be discussed, both not just from the spaces of the global north, as you put it, but also from the normal languaging spaces where people are using the unitary repertoire, as you call it, in various ways. Now, what happened in Sweden was alarming because nothing had changed on the ground. So what the Swedish uptake of that concept was doing was that people had just stopped using the concept code switching. Nothing had changed as far as teachers in those spaces. So I probably have a question here, and that is, when we are putting the speaker in the center, I wonder if you were looking at a community of practices, which I completely warm up to, it is not just the pupils who might be having a number of different named languages that they may or may not be using or articulating themselves, but that they are surrounded by in their private lives. And when they come to schools, you suddenly have monolingual ethos teachers who are then working with them, and they are just using code switching in the one era, and then post 2015, they start using translanguaging. So in those communities of practices, you cannot just have teachers not understanding. So the political move, I understand, but I think this does more harm. So that was one point that I wanted to bring up. The other was that we've seen this in Swedish spaces in 1981, when the special schools were obliged to move from an oral language teaching model for deaf pupils to a bilingual teaching model. And again, the teachers never got any input for Swedish Sign Language. But everyone to this date recognizes 1981 as a turning point. When we look at video recorded data of classroom practices, before 1981, there is a lot of so-called normal languaging going on, and we see the same thing happening afterwards. So the point is, if you're looking at circulation of concepts, I think there is need to both look at the teachers, but also to understand that what is happening in Wales differs substantially from what happens in the rich bilingual context of New York, as your biographies attest to. And from the very, I would say, a poverty-stricken monolingual situations in spaces of Sweden, where even scholars do not embody a bilingual ethos, and that you could actually count very few senior scholars who bring an other kind of awareness. So your work is really important, but I think the concepts kind of, when they are moving around, they become not just slippery, it kind of defeats the political agenda that you are trying to push for. And I completely, I think that is so important, but it doesn't, the first step doesn't go anywhere, to use one of your own metaphors. Does that make sense?
Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah.
Ricardo, you want to go first? You're muted now.
No, go ahead, Ofelia.
Oh, so Sangeeta, I've heard this before, and I think I've told you. I remember when in Georgetown many years ago, when you questioned my naming bilingual. Remember? You may not remember, but I remember. And I said to you, well, for me, I don't give up the term bilingual because for me, it was a political movement in the United States that created this conceptualization and this acknowledgement of bilingualism. So I can't give it up, because to me, it doesn't mean just two languages. It's a political struggle that I was involved in from the beginning. So I can't give it up. I think you're right that the concepts circulate differently and are taken up differently. Whether it defeats an agenda or it helps an agenda, my feeling always is that it helps. It helps because at least people like you are forcing people in Sweden, for example, to think differently about the use of translanguaging. I mean, I don't have that much experience either in Sweden or in India, but I can also tell you that my work in India was limited to Orissa, but we, I was sort of surprised by this Emily concept, right? That was used, which of course, again, did not solve anything, because for the tribal people, the beginning first grade or in one language didn't mean anything, because there were so many other ways of languaging in the community that were not being recognized in any way. So it was the same problem. I mean, I've seen it in India, I've seen it in the Philippines, where a bilingual education solution or a multilingual education solution doesn't solve anything. So, I mean, I hope that, again, this is where the conflict lies, that there is, I cannot give up the term bilingualism. And I think the trans and translanguaging for me helps me also understand that we have to live in these two parallel worlds, if you want to call it that way, because they exist socially, right? They exist socially. And I especially know this when I'm in Latin American context with indigenous people, for whom the language revitalization projects are extremely important. So the language, the named language that we all complain about, is important to their identity, just like Spanish and bilingualism is important to my identity and my grandchildren's identity. But that has no relationship to the fact that that those practices are social practices that have nothing to do with the way that bilinguals perform their lives, and that those performances then have to be evaluated differently. I think you're right. I think it's unfortunate that people pick up a term, and you're absolutely right that I actually extended the term to do much more than what Ken Williams had done in Wales with it, where again, it was input and output, and that's not what I found it useful as a term to explain what I was seeing, but maybe again, because I was interpreting trends differently. So you're right, I think that we have to be careful with the way that they circulate. I think any term that goes against the grain of concepts that have been externally imposed, I think at least open up spaces for us to debate. And I think that's better than not having the space to debate. And I see it in classrooms all the time, where you know, the opening up of translanguaging spaces within, for example, I was just this week in a school where very strict dual language allocation policy, one day in one language, one day in the other language. But the teachers have been working, I've been working with the teachers at opening up small spaces, right? So they're projects, right? So for example, there's a project, there was a debate in the 5th grade where the students then, during that time, it was supposed to be the English day, right? But during that time, they're allowed to use all their resources. They've read the material in both languages. They've written about, the debate was about whether plastics, it was 5th grade, plastics were good or not, right? But during that project, they were allowed to use all their resources. That's a little space, but it's a space that is making teachers recognize that these students know a lot more than the language of the day. Yeah, so that's important. I was in a kindergarten class where again they had done a house with all the family members and the languages that they spoke. So very traditional multilingualism. But in their this is a kindergarten class, in their retelling of the story of their families, they were using, this again was a space, all their resources, including there were 4 children in the class who spoke Mixteco, that's an indigenous language of Mexico, that was never recognized when the spaces were just English day and Spanish day. So little spaces, little cracks that I think are important. Can I tell you that this is a revolution that makes me think that we have nothing to worry about? No. This is like, I don't know, who was it that went up the mountain and came down the mountain again? Unless you push, it comes right back to what is right, thank you. It comes right back to where it was, right? The stasis just takes over. So that's what I have to say. But you're right, that it's unfortunate it's taken up differently. And I just hope that the fact that you're talking about it, I'm talking about it, and there are so many of us talking about it in different kinds of ways, opens up a space. Ricardo?
No,
Did you want to say something?
I think you both have said it very well. Thank you, Sangeeta. No, I have nothing to add right now.
Okay.
All right. I wonder if others have comments, questions. So just very quickly, I wonder what your reaction is, and I think I'll be building on some of the previous comments to the following scenario. The colleagues who have published under the label code switching and made the same sorts of claims as colleagues who have published under the translanguaging label. And in some cases, you have specific colleagues who've published under both labels and have made the same claims concerning the classroom. And I detect that from what Ofelia has said, if she had her way, she might push against some studies that self-identify as translanguaging. I worry that in some of the studies that I see, there is, to go back to Fishman, there's something that one might term as diglossic cognition. So when you say, all right, features of this language help the student understand the material better than when this other language was used. And at the level of those claims, it becomes then difficult to see on a practical level what the distinction is between the code switching explanatory framework and the translanguaging. I wonder how you react to that.
Ricardo, go ahead. Oh,
that's a very good question. It's the best kind of question because I'm not sure that I know how to answer it, but let me just think out loud. I think that as soon as one conceptualizes in terms of code switching, one is imputing to the mind the categories of the named languages of the society. To say that let's stay with the environment that I know best. To say that in the United States, I or any other Latino raised or born here, or who's learned English after immigrating, to say that those speakers are code switching is to say that they're going from, wait for it, Spanish and English to Spanish and Spanish to English in their minds, that this is what is going on mentally. This is importing into the mind and attributing to the mind the categories of two of the most widely spoken languages in the world and the languages of the two most destructive colonial experiences in history. So what the term code switching does is it installs in the minds of the speaker, for me, categories that are external to it, and that then allow for all the judgments that come from the highly standardized level that these languages are thought of by people who think about these things. And they open the door to a deficit conception of these speakers that becomes very, very wide. If you are thinking that what they're doing is going from this world thing called Spanish to this other world thing called English that has minutely defined rules of how to speak, how to order words, how to write the languages, and where the possibility of being wrong, the possibilities of being wrong, it seems to me, are behind every tree and behind every corner. So I think that the conception of the bilingual as a code switcher is very quickly, even though it appears to be an innocent descriptive category, very quickly becomes in fact a deficit category, a prescriptive category, and a category of power. Because after all, we know that these entities, the named languages, arose from situations of power creation and of trying to still today maintain the power of those of us who were trained to speak these languages according to certain standards. So code switching to me is a pretty, it can be a pretty toxic term in that it connects the speaker unwillingly to all these power dynamics in which that speaker usually comes out at the bottom. Whereas the notion of the unitary competence rings the alarm bell and says, look, this person's cognition is the way it is, and everything else that you will say about it is now reflective of your social stance and your power stance. So to me, these two things are very different. And I'm going on a bit too much because I'm thinking out loud as I answer your question that I had never really meditated on much before.
So I have thought about it, Bassi, because I think it's an excellent question. And I want to say that people accuse me of moving, but the world moves and we move with it. And something that I understood in a way with this situation may not be the same with this situation. Thank God. And I learned not only from my old mentors, but also from my young mentors, from my students. I've learned a lot. I was the mentor of Nelson Flores, and he has really pushed the racial linguistic ideologies onto the applied linguistics world, which I think is making a lot of difference. I want to say that when I started, code switching was a big thing. And we used to talk about code switching constraints. And I even used to use it when, because I wanted to make sure that the teachers that I was working with, bilingual teachers, did not feel inferior because of their code switching use, right? But the more that I thought about it, the more that I know that the structural constraints didn't make any sense, because within my family, within the community, these structural constraints do not exist. So I think the danger of, for example, Jeff Maxwan calling the whole thing multilingual translanguaging is that it holds on to the old notions. It holds on to, for example, code switching. And it allows people to do what Sangeeta was complaining about, the fact that then people pick it up and it's nothing new and it doesn't have political import and it doesn't resist racial linguistic ideologies and it doesn't make listeners think differently, generously, etc. So I think there is a difference and a danger in continuing to talk about code switching or talking about multilingual translanguaging when what some are referring to is simply code switching. And you're right, Bassi. It's some people are using it interchangeably, and I don't think I wouldn't use it that way. But again, this is all about Sangeeta's question about the circulation of concepts and how people take them up. Yeah.
Okay. So thanks a lot, Mari, Anita.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a quick question about racial linguistics and a manifesto that you published in Critical Inquiry in Language Studies. I really enjoyed reading it. One question that sort of remained was a sort of ideological stance toward academic language. So I totally understand your argument and ideological stance that it's a really hegemonic idea, but at the same time, sort of academic language is so tied with different disciplines. Not teaching them feels like disservice to students. So I concur with the idea academic language really sort of hegemonic practice, but in practicality, teachers have to sort of teach it. So could we think about more about students developing different repertoire, and one of which is a hegemonic practice? So I just wanted to get your sort of thoughts on this matter.
That's a great question, Maddie. I think that, I think our thinking about academic language is, if you are in schools in the United States anyway, right now, When you ask the teachers, the big thing is these students don't have academic language. And if you ask them what is academic language, they really can't tell. They just tell you it's what these students do not have. And more, I've been convinced by Flores and Rosa's argument that the problem is not the students, the problem is what they call the white listening subject, right? The listener with institutional power who says, these practices are not academic. And what we try to do with translanguaging is precisely to let students know that their practices at home are also academic. And as you know, scholars have been trying to define academic language for a very long time, but and they've done a great job at it. And yet, when you think about what it is that they're describing, again, practices of monolingual middle-class speakers and not practices of bilingual racialized speakers. So that is where academic language is a problem. Having said that, I do think that all of us who work in schools understand that part of schooling is precisely to develop, I want to say, the students' repertoire to include features that may be considered academic. But we want to make sure that they understand that that definition of what is academic, that definition is a social construct that has nothing to do with academic. And that's why I encourage teachers to make a difference, to differentiate between general language proficiency, our ability to tell jokes, to make an argument, to narrate, and specific language features, right? Because those are two different things. And unless you differentiate, you're always going to be judging the student who does not have those academic features, those features that have been named academic by someone externally. You're always going to consider them inferior. So it's a matter of thinking about it differently. Ricardo.
Thank you, Marie. I would say I would not ask the question that way, and I would not answer the question that way. I would not entertain any question about academic language, because academic language is yet another dialect. It is constructing something independent of the linguistic features, and then searching about, well, what is academic language? How do I define it? The moment you get into that situation, I think you have put yourself into a theoretical, you have painted yourself into a theoretical corner. There are some features that are more valued in an academic setting than others, but one must disaggregate and discuss the features one by one. There is no academic language any more than there is British English or Castilian Spanish. These things are inventions, and these things, if you pose the question in those terms, you get nowhere in my judgment. So I would say, perhaps saying, I don't want none as opposed to I don't want any, and there are less people, there are less children as opposed to fewer children. If you go feature by feature, some of these things are more valued in the academy, some are not, but I think one really has to do it in a disaggregated way, feature by feature, and deprive these words of the ontological heft that they acquire the moment you begin to speak about academic language. There isn't academic language. There are some features that are more valued in the academy than others. Then that opens the door to the next step, which is to say that it matters a great deal who is using those features. If one of our students says he ain't coming, that ain't in that situation is not an academically sanctioned feature. If the teacher says, well, that ain't what I'm talking about, guys, with a smile, all of a sudden that same ain't is an academic feature. So I would urge all of us to think not in terms of these invented categories, but in terms of feature by feature. And then, of course, Marie, the preoccupation that you have is very real. How do we at the same time legitimate the features of the language of these students? And inform them of the social situation that they're in and the availability of an alternative feature. If you ask me the question in those disaggregated ways, then I can deal with it. Otherwise, I find it impossibly abstract to deal with these questions of who speaks American English, who speaks academic English, or any of those highly abstract inventions.
Mhm. That makes a lot of sense, and I really appreciate your answer. Part of I don't subscribe to academic language. I'm just sort of like going with the flow. That's sort of like what people use. But after that manifesto was published, I noticed the grad students saying, so Ofelia Garcia is saying we don't have to teach academic language, right? Like every language is equal. And so I just wanted to understand the conceptual underpinning of it. So when we have discussion, I can have really sort of a, well-informed understanding of what you're saying. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
But I want to ask Vishna, Edwin, Dati, some of the students to jump in and comment what they've made of this conversation. Vishna, then Edwin, Dati, and any other students, Byron.
There's also Maya who wanted to make a quick comment before dashing off. So maybe Maya, you could start.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. I'm afraid she's left.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
So sorry then, Vishna.
Yes, well, I think, thank you so much, Dr. Ofelia Garcia and Ricardo Otheguy, for your wonderful presentation. I very much enjoyed it, and it definitely resonates with me. I actually taught a functional grammar class this past semester, and it's informed the way that I think I will teach the class in the future with regards to, being given the task of teaching standard English students who are then going to go on to teach their own ESL students. And so, I have students coming in that want to bring in bilingual practices. And then I was reading their final papers last week, and some of them are saying, like our ultimate goal is for the learners to produce a product fully in English. And I kind of, push back on that a bit. And it's really great now to have ways of like new frameworks for thinking on how to push back on that. And so I really, I'm really grateful to you for providing that.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Edwin, what do you have to say?
For me, it's a realization that some of the things that I've been thinking of, or some of the things that I've been thinking about, rather, the discrepancy that I see in my own language practices and what I was taught in the classroom, I kind of overlooked them for a long time because I couldn't find examples in the classrooms that I learned and in the educational environments that I was in as a young language teacher and even as a student. I couldn't find models to explain how things were going on back home, or like back when I went home, when I was speaking to my family members and all that. And so gradually I'm getting, even though definitely I'm far from understanding this whole thing, I'm kind of getting to the aha moment, and I'm trying to understand that some of the things that I learned have to be unlearned and question these very things that I've come to understand, and then find words to probably describe how. So for example, I taught English back in my home country, Ghana. And for most of the time we did a lot of code switching, and we use the terminology code switching a lot. And for most of my undergraduate time, we used Chomskyan grammar, we read Andrew Carney, did syntax and all that, and never were we told about the social implications of grammar. So it's coming to the realization, listening to these discussions and trying to find words to describe experientially what we have learned. So I think there's a generic way that I could see.
That's interesting. Byron, what's your response to what you have heard?
For me, it's more like personal reflection on like who I am, because I'm an immigrant from Hong Kong. When I came here when I was 18 years old, and when I heard the term bilingual, I am not sure if I'm qualified because my Cantonese writing is not good enough, and then like my English is not good enough, and then my Japanese has accent by like native speakers. So like I always think about like who I am in terms of like my language repertoire, and like today's talk is very useful, like for me to discover myself and then like to recategorize who I am as like a person. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. And then, okay, then there's Anna Tarkosic. Anna, what's your response? Okay, Ashraf, before you disappear.
Thank you so, thank you so much. Well, I did enjoy the intervention by Ofelia and Ricardo, and situated the concept in a historical, in a wide historical context. The question which is my view also that, you know, the best way to understand translanguaging is to see it as a dear friend to colonial linguistics. I think Ofelia touched on that point very well, because it's a negation of or critique of the colonial conception of language. So the question is, who is the audience for this concept? Obviously, it's the academics, it's us, teachers, and so on, but not the layperson on the street. Because it's an academic concept, as you said. And as I said, also in another context, you can't go to your mother and you say, language doesn't exist. It's just translanguage. you get kicked on the face. Yeah. So that's one thing. The second thing is that when I said it's a companion to, should be seen as a companion to colonial linguistics, because it makes us think about ideology, not just practice. We agree that people at the actual level of practice, complete practice, they're translanguaging. That's true. But the question of ideology is very important. Otherwise, the question of inequality will be erased. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Important.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that not only should you not tell your grandmother or your mother that a language does not exist, don't tell anybody that, even it is, to reiterate, it is not a matter of existence, it is a matter of what the sanction is for the existence. Is it a social sanction, or is it are we dealing with social entities or cognitive entities? And the trick is to be able to manipulate that difference. So don't tell her language does not exist. It does.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It exists as part of a particular level of reality. That's right. As an effect. I entirely agree. Yes.
Right. Okay. Is there anybody else who wants to chip in before? What about Eldin Milaki? Yeah, Eldin, yes. What's your...
Hello.
What did you make? Hello.
Well, first of all, I have to say translanguaging for me was a discovery, because my entire life, whenever someone asked me how many languages I speak, I couldn't count them. So it was really nice to find a theory that kind of explained what's happening in my head. what I've been struggling with more recently is trying to figure out how to make it functional in the classroom. And not in the sense of what I do with the students, but rather what do I do with my colleagues, my boss, my department head, my, supervisors, people who, and, I'm also, I grew up with, Victoria Fromkin, and I was studying very much traditional linguistics. So I know where they're coming from. But I simply don't agree with it anymore. And it's a struggle for me to sort of push through what I want to do. Particularly, I'm currently in South Korea, by the way. So super developed country, but very behind in some ways in terms of language.
So Eldon, for your colleagues, I want to recommend the website of the project that Ricardo and I were involved in at CUNY for a long time. I'm going to put it in the chat room, and you can look up this website, and I think it will give you ideas for teachers. It's not perfect, but it's a beginning, and I think people understand it. So do that.
Good. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Is there anybody who hasn't said anything, Cliff, before we thank Ricardo and Ofelia? Cliff.
Okay, I just wanted to say that in the South African case, the idea of the translanguaging theory, when it is placed side by side the Constitution, it may not be compatible because the project is a multilingual identity, which of course no institution has been able to frame. I wanted to make that comment that perhaps there's an under-theorization, perhaps because you came into the work with a bilingual perspective, maybe we need some people who can come in with the project under multilingualism, and then see what kind of transformative theorization can come from there. Yeah, and then another point I wanted to comment on was on the social categories that Ricardo mentioned. I was just wondering now, thinking about language teaching even within a university, it looks to me that a lot that is being taught then might just be social categories and not language. I wanted to comment on that. Thanks.
Okay, let's move on to Anna. Anna, do you have anything to say?
Good evening. I'm sorry I couldn't answer the first time. It's pretty late in Australia. Thank you very much for the conversation. I also grew up in an environment where in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where we have named languages, and there's a huge political aspect of naming languages. So growing up, I didn't know how to negotiate that, how to work with this, because I speak 3 languages, 3 named languages, but for me, it's just one big language. I understand everyone understands me. And now in Australia, the main issue that I'm having with, because I'm writing about translingualism, about translingual perspective, but here when we're teaching students, there is no translingual perspective. What's expected of us is to teach them rules, is to teach them how to teach rules. And I feel like we still haven't moved on from that, even in Australia, which is the global north. There is no progress. And I feel like whatever I'm writing about academically does not go well with what I'm practicing in the classroom, because I don't have enough space to change anything that's happening. I feel like in the classroom, we're still stuck maybe some 50 years ago, and there is no change. So how do we move on from there? How do we tell students in the field of education who are teaching English language that they need to use translanguaging in the classroom when you have NAPLAN test in Australia that requires certain kind of grammar rules and certain kind of English knowledge that is pure and clean and devoid of any other external influence, linguistic influence. yeah, those are some of the things that I'm
Interesting.
constantly thinking about.
That's interesting. Busi, what's your take? No, I'm asking, yes.
It's an interesting topic. One area that I related to was when Ofelia was talking about, being called a stupid Cuban girl. It sort of reminded me of my experience as an undergraduate. Of course, I wasn't called a stupid girl. I did call the university stupid, but it was it was because when I had good grades for English at high school, but the university had also an English entry exam, which presumably I failed dismally. And then I had to take remedial English in order to continue with my study. Well, you had to continue with your studies, but also take your remedial English classes as well. The assumption, or what was that you would not make it in your studies if you do not pass the remedial English. But I was so upset that I decided I wasn't going to do the remedial English myself, but I was going to find a way of working myself out of it. So I got my cousin, who was doing an English honors degree, to write the assignments that I would get from the remedial English. The remedial English classes were on a Tuesday, on a Thursday. So if you couldn't make it on Tuesday, you go on a Thursday. I got a girl who was going to go to the class on Tuesday. So she would get all the in-class activities. So by Thursday, when I get to the class, I've got all the answers and I just give them the answers. And that's how I arranged my semester. Then, so I didn't really pay attention to the remedial classes because I had made this arrangement for myself, which worked very well. I passed the remedial English classes. But now the catch became one where I was the top student in all my classes. And then the university had a newsletter. So in the newsletter, they were now promoting the remedial class, saying the top student in her undergraduate studies was a product of the remedial class. But I had never done the remedial class. So that's what and my cousin, who was writing the take-home assignments, was the one who brought, because it was written via the English department, was the one who brought the copy of the newsletter and said, "You scumbag."
Anyway.
When I read it, oh, what am I supposed to do now? Well, I let it go because my cousin was saying, well, you either have to confess, and then the university knows that the remedial class isn't working, and then they will say you are dishonest, and then you will be punished. So you have to choose. So I decided, well, let sleeping dogs lie. I passed. That's it.
Sinfree and Basi and Busi and
Thank
everybody.
You very much. Thank you very
Anissa, much. I have to go, but I
thoroughly
thoroughly enjoyed it. And thank you, Sinfree, for all you've started, for all you have taught us, and introducing me to Basi and to Anissa and to all these wonderful people.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
It's been great.